Hello world, my name is Tim Roswick, and today I want to show you a little bit about the progress for my current 1,000-hour project, Cypherpunk. It is a stealth hacking roguelike that we are working on. We're trying to get it under 1,000 hours, and I want to kind of show you the progress that we made in the week following its origination in the jam. So let's get started. So it started out as a jam game, as you could tell. Here's the itch page. It was more of a puzzle type game at first, and when I originally launched it on the jam, it was Cypherpunk, Daemons Never Die. That was kind of the whole tagline, because the daemons are the enemies and they never died. And I used this hot pink cyberpunk kind of theme and tone to it, and the whole game had this blue darker tone, and I was really actually pretty happy with the page and all that stuff, but it wasn't quite what I wanted. So we underwent a series of changes. The main one being this overworld map didn't really make sense. It was just kind of a barrier to the gameplay. There was nothing really there, as you could tell. It's just kind of these nodes, and that was the first thing that I wanted to tackle and work on, because there was no decision. There was no tactical decision to be made there. So it really didn't make any sense to have that like sitting there, because like what just pick a node. There's no difference in picking one. But as you can see, once you pick a node, it goes into the actual game. And earlier in this process, these maps were kind of small. And there's a lot going on here, but basically there are resources right at the top. There's energy, chips, and data. And you go around the map trying to collect these resources while also trying to keep your threat level low. And every time you move, the threat level goes up. So it creates this kind of like sense of urgency where you want to get out of the server as quick as possible, but at the same time, you want to get as much resources as possible. And if the threat level goes up like that, something happens called a threat protocol. And in this instance, a daemon boot plus wake just basically boots an enemy and wakes him up. So you got to be pretty careful, because they're dormant by default. Another thing you're looking for is these golden chips right here. These are special abilities and power-ups that you can acquire, and they do different interesting things. They all have their own little abilities, so you want to look out for them and grab them. But once you grab that one, the rest of them disappear. So you've got to always make a choice. And siphoning will go ahead and increase the threat level. So one of the things too that's really, really important is this whole. First of all, there's a firewall threat protocol, which I'm pretty happy with. I was really, really happy with that and how it all worked and everything. The game itself needed a lot of work after the jam. It needed a lot of optimization work, but it needed a lot of iconization and just basically usability stuff. So what you see me doing here is basically changing some of the icons to make them more visually represent. I use game-icons.net, which, by the way, shout out to them. You can use icons as long as you give them attribution. It's a great resource site and tool that I recommend. I'm making icons for special abilities here, because I felt like a lot of the abilities didn't have icons, and like I was trying to get it played without some of the icons, but like you just can't. Nobody knows what any of this stuff does, and the mouse overs, you need icons to be able to identify stuff. So we're implementing these new abilities in the game here with all these different icons. And basically, if you're wondering what program I'm using, it's Construct 3. That's the engine. I'm implementing them. So as you can see, these different map generators, they will generate the icons on top of the chips, the gold chips, and there'll be abilities. I'm just kind of running through and testing all these different things. Now, one of the issues that we ran into doing this was the distribution of the abilities, and also you couldn't tell on the nodes, but when you're going to click on a node, it doesn't tell you whether there's an ability there. I wanted you to basically make a tactical choice. Do you want an ability? Do you want health? Do you want, what do you want? So one of the things that I'm working on the nodes here is I'm trying to give you the option to say, hey, I want this thing instead of this thing, rather than just use the current map like it is, where there's really no choice to be made. So one of the things I did is I added some data. And you'll see this in a little bit, but the first thing is there's an IP address for every server, and the server the IP address is actually the seed that generates it randomly. So if you give your IP address to your friend, they can play the same seed as you, which is pretty interesting. So here what I'm doing is I'm basically adding a little box there. That didn't end up working out. I don't know, it just didn't look right. It looked bad. And so I wanted the IP address there because obviously that's the seed of the thing, but the more I organized it, the more I was just kind of like, okay, this doesn't, I don't know. I think the color and the size of things really, really matters. So if you're like doing something like this and you size something bigger than the rest of the stuff, you have to keep in mind that like what you're telling the player is that, hey, that thing is more important than the rest of the stuff. And as a hacker, the whole theme of it, like I wanted the IP address of the server, that's like the big thing. But like as a game player, the IP address doesn't really matter. What matters is the decision with the power-ups and the health and all that stuff, the tactical decisions. So I went back and forth on sizing and all that and how the layout should work. And I was really struggling with that because like I don't really consider myself an artist. Like I'm pretty happy with the artwork that I've done, but like usually I get to where I want to go with my artwork by trying a bunch of shit and like crossing my fingers and keep doing it until I get something that looks good. I don't actually have any art training or understanding of any of that. So like I was just kind of testing stuff out, and that's pretty much all I'm doing is I'm literally just testing stuff out. And then one of the other ideas I had too is that what if you could actually do things with abilities on this overworld type of map? Like what if you could scan it, or you could fortify it, or whatever? Kind of like if you've ever played the latest Deus Ex games with the hacking minigame and stuff, how once you secure a node, you can start an alarm, and then the alarm will start trying to find you. But if you fortify a node in that game, then it will like slow the thing down. I was thinking of having like a mini game like that on the overworld type of map. So there's like a game you're playing on the overworld, but there's also like a micro game, which is the actual game itself, the whole roguelike thing. So I put these little icons there because I was like, okay, what if you could use resources to scan or fortify these nodes, or the power button to even reboot them? Because if there's a resource that, like if you need health or something and there's a power up there, what if you could like pay resources to reboot the map until you get health or something like that? We played around with a bunch of ideas, and like I said, the thing is I kept the IP address so big, and like it made sense in the theme, but it just didn't make a ton of sense. And then I have the reward there, the Bitcoin reward, because you're supposed to get coins for each individual one. But then I was like, it made more sense to have the Bitcoin reward the same for every node, because I couldn't figure out a way to like balance it. Like, why would one node be worth more than other nodes? Like, okay, maybe one node is harder, right? But how do I determine what difficulty in a procedurally generated game? Do I spawn more enemies? But then like some of these maps are so constrained that like, how do you do that? So it was really difficult. And what I actually ended up with here at the end was a game that I thought was pretty fun. And this is the first post-jam version of the game. It's got fire in it. It's got the enemies. We also changed the enemies color from pink to red. I just think red is the universal bad color. So I thought that looked a little bit better. We use pink. We use really hot pink as part of the original build because of the whole cyberpunk theme. And by the way, the way that I got the colors for this game was literally, I Googled a Tron screenshot and I just stole the colors off of a Tron screenshot. So if you're ever looking for inspiration for colors, Google things and just steal their colors, because I have no idea how to pick accurate colors that fit well together. But you know what? If you steal someone else's color palette, it works really well. The firewall thing I really, really liked, but the fire, oh my God. It was a little too powerful. It fucked things over a little bit too much. So I had to tone that down in later builds. But as you can see, like a map like this, the difficulty doesn't come down to how many enemies. It comes down to the enemy placement. So making things harder was complicated. And if you could see, we changed around the UI a little bit too. We put the threat protocol on the right and the HUD stuff on the left. The reason for that was like basically all the good stuff is on the left and all the bad stuff is on the right. It didn't make sense to put the bad stuff next to the good stuff. Another thing that we did is we changed from threats to health. And what I'm doing here, by the way, is I am modifying these sprites which act as map generators. So I have these shapes that I randomly spawn. And then when I spawn them, they go over a series of tiles, and then it spawns a map with those tiles. And the one I was editing right there, it was creating things a little bit weird. Now, this was a really cool map generator. It created maps unlike any other maps that I've seen. I pick a random shape, pick a random angle, pick a random size, and then just fill in the tiles over the top of it, which was really cool. And then I would do the same thing for the chips, so you end up with clustered chips, which looks a little more natural. But the problem was islands. Islands were a problem. And as you can see here, there's an island there, and it's not always a problem, but it's a problem because if it spawns the exit on an island, you're fucked. You can't do anything. That's game over. And the problem is, like, in procedural generation, if something can happen, it will happen, abso-fucking-lutely. And you can't ship a game like that where somebody can play the game and just run into a map that will just end their run. It wouldn't work. So even though it was rare, I had to mess with the map generator to get it. And this is actually, I really like this version of the game, to be honest. I think in a different life we would have stuck with this and made it, stuck to this puzzle simplicity of it before, because it was interesting and I enjoyed building this out. This original version was inspired by a game called 868 Hack, which has the same siphoning mechanic and it has the resource mechanic and all that stuff. But that game felt a little thin to me depth-wise. Like, it was fun and it was interesting to play, but it just felt like there wasn't enough there. So I wanted to take that concept and kind of bring it to like a roguelike level and kind of expand on it. And that's why we ended up with the whole siphoning thing with multiple resources and these enemy types. But here's the thing I made, is one of the things I copied from 866 Hack 2 was the gun. You see how I'm shooting enemies? And later on, this would become a problem because look what I'm doing. I'm running up to enemies and I'm just blasting them in the face. And that's the OP strategy for the game. That's what you do. You run up to enemies, you blast them in the face. So that is one of the things that we ended up changing in later builds, because in order to make it a stealth game, the problem is you give a player a gun and then all they do is just run and shoot, right? Like that's what we're trained to do as players, is like, you give a gun, okay, well then I gotta shoot. But if you don't give them a gun, well shit, what do you do then? And later on, it's really interesting when we get to there, because it was cool when I made that change. But after we added the data to the nodes and I modified it to where I was happy, where it actually showed you, okay, this node has health, this node has whatever, we had that island issue. And I kept refreshing maps, because even though sometimes it wouldn't build islands, it would build these little like diagonal lanes that you couldn't get to because you can only move northeast, south, or west, and so on and so forth. So I had to fix that map generator. So we made a series of changes. I liked my original map generator, how it just picked random shapes and random angles and then did that. But I wanted to keep that, but I wanted to create an island fixer. And this was one of our Twitch stream people ideas. Somebody in the Twitch chat wrote an algorithm for me and was helping me out build it, that's a advantage of streaming, by the way. You can get people in to help you out with your stuff. So we were messing around with this whole thing for, I would say, a solid like 8 hours this day. It was crazy. It took a long time, and again, like, this is I believe this is before I had the seed system in too, so I couldn't take the same seed and test it over and over and over again for islands. I had to keep regenerating levels to try different stuff, and that was a pain in the ass, because procedurally generating a level and then hoping that your algorithm, every level that it generates for infinity, is playable is rough. And so that's ultimately why I ended up doing the whole IP address seed system, is because partially for testing. Like, I need to, whatever it's generating, I need to be able to play that same map over and over again to test, because this was so tedious to debug. Even though it made some really cool looking maps, it's just, I couldn't test the same one more than once, and like every time I wanted to test a change, I would just have to keep regenerating and regenerating and regenerating. And it was weird. It was time consuming and it was rough. So one of the things I ended up learning was the shapes are cool, but one, you don't want drastically different shapes, because the more drastically different shapes that you have, the more players notice them. And that's one of the things I noticed too, is like, I have this U-shaped one that keeps coming up, But that's really, really noticeable. Players notice, okay, this is a U-shaped map, and it kind of takes away from the randomness and procedural generation, because even though it's slightly different every time, players notice that that U-shape, which is something I ended up cutting because it was really recognizable, and it was also one of the ones that kept breaking the algorithm. And I don't know why, because these were one-screen levels, kind of like Phalophobia 2. I don't know why I start with one-screen games, but I kind of like the simplicity of it, I think. So the map also had to fit on the screen, and sometimes the sizing parameters of the thing, for whatever reason, would go off-screen. And the problem is, if it went off-screen off the tile range, it would get cut off. And so what you're seeing in some of these maps, especially some of these U-shaped maps, is you get the vertical lines from the U, but you're not getting the horizontal line that connects them, because they're too it's too long. And I didn't notice that at first when I was debugging. So I actually ended up removing that from the map gen, just because it was one of the problems that we were having to begin with, but also because it was really, really noticeable. And I noticed that, like, it's weird, the more generic you make at least your map gen, not necessarily like your obstacle generator and your enemy generator and all that, especially in a stealth game, that stuff is really important. But the actual map size, the different algorithms that you have, like the different shapes and stuff, the more they seem repetitive. Whereas if you have like the same general shape every time, but just small differences, they seem less repetitive to players for some reason. Because the challenge isn't so much about the actual map shape, it's about the shape within the actual shape. So I tried to keep shapes that are pretty similar, but subtle enough different to where it was kind of cool to do it. So if you notice, I pulled up Twisted Metal a little bit. Originally, the game concept for this was Neon Dream, and I wanted to, if you guys remember the Twisted Metal games back in the day, how Twisted Metal is basically a competition, and you would pick these guys, and they all wanted to win Twisted Metal so they could get a wish from the guy Calypso. And I always liked that story. So Cypherpunk Neon Dream was supposed to be the competition. The most elite hackers in the world would join this competition, and they would get access to the Neon Dream if they won, which was like the cyberspace world of craziness. Now here's the finished map generator for this version. It works pretty well. We still had some issues with it, and I made the fixer tiles transparent. So as you can see, it generates the map, but then another algorithm afterwards fixes it. And the transparent tiles are the ones that it gets rid of. So as you can see, we start with a map, and then I got an algorithm that kind of fixes the little pieces. That worked really well. That's a really, really good way to do it, because you end up with these unique shapes, but then you got a fixer that will make sure that everything kind of works well together. And as you can see, I was really, really happy with that layout, because that was like the best of both worlds. You could make really unique looking maps, but you could also make sure that they were playable and they were fixable. Some of the stuff I don't really like, but overall I was pretty happy with the map generator. And so that worked out pretty well, I think. So that was the game. That was the first week after the Cyberpunk Jam, and we ended up with a pretty sweet little project. I'm really happy with it. I enjoyed working on it. And next week I'll have another video for you on kind of what we did from here after we fixed the map generator and we fixed the different things. I learned a lot. Procedural generation is not easy like I thought it was. That sounds stupid to say, because of course procedural generation is hard, but it was difficult to learn, and I'll be sharing everything that I learned along the way. So hopefully I will see you next time.